Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ethics Grand Rounds. I'm really delighted to be able to bring this conversation to our audience today. I think it's going to be a really interesting and important one. Before we begin with introduction to the speaker and topic and so on, let me talk a little bit about the logistics for today's event. Next slide, please, Andrea. Thank you. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function. You can do that to either ask or follow up on your questions. And you can also use the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, to let Center for Bioethics staff know if you're having any sort of technical difficulties, and they will be able to respond privately to you in order to resolve those issues. Please do not use the raise your hand function. That will not work for us, unfortunately, at today's event. The event is being recorded. Within just a short period of time after the event is finished today, you'll be able to access the recording at the link that is there on the slide. I will say that that link will also be in the presentation details document, which center staff will soon post to the chat, a link to that document. The presentation details document that will get posted to the chat has a lot of information about logistics for today. And so it's a nice sort of resource that you can refer to. We ask that you complete an evaluation. We have a very, very brief evaluation that should really take less than 5 minutes, but we take very, very seriously the feedback that we get from our participants in these webinars. There are 3 ways that you can access the evaluation. First, when this webinar has ended and your Zoom window closes, it will pop up in your browser, and if it is convenient, you can fill it out immediately. If not, just click out of it. It's also linked in the presentation details document, which again is going to be available through a link in the chat. And you will also receive an email after the event with a link to complete it. We don't want to badger you. We just want to give you lots of opportunities to complete it at your convenience, because we really do want to hear from you. Next slide, please. So there are a number of types of credit that different groups can get for attendance at today's webinar. University of Minnesota students with active status in health professions programs can receive interprofessional education credit for attendance at today's webinar. You'll be required to attend at least 75% of the event today. And we also ask that you complete the reflection form that is linked in the presentation details document in order to receive credit. If you have any questions, feel free to contact center staff about that. If you would like to request a certificate of attendance for continuing ed credits, please complete the form that's linked in the presentation details document. It can take a few days for certificates to be issued, so please be patient as we process all the requests. And I also need to say that given accreditation requirements, you have to attend a minimum of 75% of today's talk in order to receive a certificate. Finally, biomedical engineering students, you can email your program at the email address that you see on the slide, which is also included in the presentation details document, and they will see to getting you ethics credit for your program. Next slide, please. Those of you who have attended Ethics Grand Rounds before know that we always partner with other units on campus to bring you these events. And we are very, very grateful for the partnership of our co-sponsors. So I want to thank them now. Our co-sponsors for today's event are the University of Minnesota Clinical and Translational Science Institute, our College of Pharmacy, the Med School, the School of Nursing, the School of Public Health, the Program in Health Disparities Research, and the Center for Race, Indigeneity, Disability, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Next slide, please. Finally, we get to the good part of the day. I am delighted to present to you today Dr. Willyanne DeCormier Plosky, who is Acting Program Director at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard University, where she focuses primarily on initiatives within the diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical research portfolio. I have to say she has an impressive bio with a tremendous depth of experience and expertise, and we have the full bio linked in the presentation details document, so you can review it there. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you now, Dr. Plosky, for your talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you to all of the participants for attending today. Just give me one moment to share my slides. All right. Is everyone able to see that?
That looks perfect.
Great. Okay. So my name is Willyanne DeCormier Plosky. And as mentioned, I'm the Acting Program Director at the MRCT Center. I'm going to be speaking to you today on equitable inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research. I have to put up the standard disclaimer form that the views expressed today are my own, and they don't imply endorsement or reflect the views of the US FDA, NIH, or any other affiliated organizations. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions, and I have no personal conflicts of interest with this presentation. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. First of all, I am a person with a disability and also the parent of a child with disabilities. I have brown hair, brown eyes, and I wear glasses. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's and Harvard, just for those of you who are not familiar with our work yet. So the MRCT Center, we are kind of a convening organization for all of the clinical research community, whether it's sponsors, pharmaceutical organizations, research teams, regulatory agencies, CROs, which are contract research organizations, sites. We kind of span the gamut, and for participants and patients. So we're kind of a convening organization, and our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of clinical trials. And how we do that is by identifying opportunities for improvement through kind of this dialogue among all of our stakeholders. We develop standards and best practices, and we really work on transparently communicating all of the materials that we develop. We try and make all of our materials very actionable and practical, so that they're kind of take-home materials, so that it's not just kind of talking the talk, it's really trying to walk the walk. I just wanted to kind of put up on the screen, and I will be putting links in the chat later. You can go to our website at mrctcenter.org. We recently put out an annual report where you can kind of see all of the different things that we're doing. And that'll kind of give you a good background to all the different projects in the MRCT Center. So on the screen from the annual report, you can see some of these different projects. I put this on the screen because, and this is just a snapshot of some of the different projects. You can see data sharing and privacy, health literacy, working in pediatrics, decentralization of clinical trials, bioethics. All of these actually are important to inclusion of people with disabilities. For example, decentralization of clinical trials right now is one of the kind of hot topics in clinical trials. And we often hear a lot about improving efficiency of clinical trials, bringing them closer to people. However, that does require a lot of thinking when it comes to inclusion of people with disabilities, because when you're creating decentralized tools or decentralized sites, you need to make sure that these are also accessible to people with disabilities. So I'm going to, because the talk is on equitable inclusion of people with disabilities, I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to talk about the equity piece first. So one of our projects at the MRCT Center is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's sort of my home base, and you'll see it highlighted here on the slide. So I'm going to kind of get into a little bit, just very briefly, on our DE&I work, because it really frames kind of the bigger picture of working on inclusion. So the MRCT Center has been closely involved. I'm going to call it DE&I. I think you've probably heard this term quite a bit. We've been working closely on DE&I since 2017. One of the products that we created over several years of dialogue with clinical research stakeholders is this guidance document and toolkit. It is a large document. It's about 400 pages, as you can see. It can be purchased from Amazon or downloaded on the website. It goes into broad scale. It has lots of case studies and examples, but really broad across everything that needs to be thought of for a specific trial to incorporate DE&I into that trial. The guidance document has a companion toolkit that's also on the web, which has a lot of different kinds of tools that really bring specificity to how to operationalize DE&I. So you can see on the right side of the screen, this is just one snapshot from the study design section, and you can see kind of a selection of different tools. So we have on the screen a study design logic model, study design key performance indicators, screen failure tracking log, eligibility log, site selection models. So there's kind of a lot of different resources on there, and they're meant to kind of span the gamut for all underrepresented populations. So all of DE&I within this broad toolkit. So then talking about one of the other more recent tools that we have. So this is called the Equity by Design Metrics Framework. So we put out that guidance document in 2020. A lot of people said they were using it, that's a great document. However, they really wanted to have not only a broader framework, so not just one specific trial, but how do you set up kind of the system so that when you get into a trial, you have these kind of pieces in place. So you have things like the commitment is already there, the resources are there, you already have community engagement. That's not something that you can just kind of start, right from the get-go of the trial. It really needs to be long-term, sustainable in place. So they wanted kind of this broader, even broader picture, but they also wanted accountability, measurable, specific targets and goals. So we created this Equity by Design Metrics framework with these 7 themes that you can kind of see in that wheel that's on the screen. For those who might not be able to see the wheel, it starts with commitment and goes to engagement, goes to data, then engagement, then educational opportunity, which is workforce development, strategies for inclusion, which is really around all of your study protocol and study conduct, then going into review, and finally going into kind of dissemination, really bringing it full circle, because even if you meet your goals, there's still always a long road to go. So basically what we do is we have quantitative and qualitative measures within this metrics framework to kind of, they're basically thinking prompts for how to potentially measure your progress in DE&I and how to get to those kind of quantitative goals or outcomes. So I just wanted to pull this piece up because within theme C on partnerships, communication, and engagement, you can see C.2, this is the qualitative measures. One of our measures is on respectful and accessible communication platforms and materials. We have things that say like that the imagery and communication needs to respect the preferences of attended audiences, that the communication platforms need to be accessible. So we get there, we have these kind of macro prompts, and the response we always get back is how. We really want more detail on the how. So that's how we're going to get into the Accessibility by Design Toolkit in a moment. But just to To preface that a little bit, I wanted to kind of drill down now. So we talked about the MRCT Center, the DE&I work, and then how we got into doing some of this work on inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research. So within the big guidance document, as I said, it was applicable to all populations. However, over time, we've been trying to drill down into specific populations in more depth. So about 1.5 years ago, we convened a working group that's with the Harvard Law School, University of Utah Law School, University of Columbia Medical Center, and several others to start kind of brainstorming on what are key areas that we really need to work on in terms of inclusivity for people with disabilities. On the screen, you'll see a couple of the papers that we've published recently. So kind of two of the main thrusts when people were asking about the how. One was on inclusion of people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. And one other piece was kind of the how on broad scale on talking about, all the different really practical things, which I'll get into later, but practical things like how do you do a color contrast checker? How do you do, setting up your protocol so that you have the appropriate language in there, respectful language. So on the screen, one of the things that we've been working on is supported decision-making. So this differs from surrogate decision-making. Surrogate decision-making is when you have a person that is making the decision for a person with disability. So that person may be a legally authorized representative or a guardian. Supported decision-making is when the person with a disability autonomously makes their own decisions, but they invite a supporter to help them kind of filter through the information that they're getting and to communicate their preferences back to the research team. So we've been putting out a couple of publications on supported decision-making. We also did another paper where we did a data analysis of clinical research protocol eligibility criteria to see if the language in that eligibility criteria may exclude people with disabilities. Because as you know, or you may know, there's no studies don't collect data, at least not that we know of, on people with disabilities. So it's very hard to know who's in trials, who's been excluded or not. So we kind of tried to go around that a little bit to see if there might be exclusion through the language. So what you see on the screen, this paper, what we did was we broke disability into the different domains that you see on the right side of the screen, such as cognitive disabilities, visual, hearing, mobility. We looked in the eligibility criteria to see within each of these, if the eligibility criteria A said something specific about that disability category. So for example, people with visual disabilities or visual impairment are excluded, kind of writ large. We also looked to see if specific disabilities were excluded. So for visual, for example, people with macular degeneration were excluded. So you can see on the screen that quite a few of these disability categories were excluded. Particularly, you can see cognitive and intellectual disabilities, people who use substances, and somewhat HIV and hepatitis as well, and then somewhat within the others. We also wanted to show in our paper that we tried to look and see if the exclusions listed in the eligibility criteria were actually justified, if there is any justification given, because if there's no justification given for exclusion based on safety or ethics data, that's discrimination. So you can see that on the right-hand side, the investigator discretion we looked at closely. Many of the studies, I think 95% of the studies, something like that, had investigator discretion allowances. Because they're so broad and they're so subjective, this leaves a lot of room for investigators or the people who are screening participants to say, that they have the discretion to exclude people. We also saw that when the exclusion mentioned certain disabilities, that we weren't sure like there wasn't the justification, you could call it justified because it was a justification listed in the paper, but we would quibble to say that it's actually justified. So we would see a lot often where it would say something like the person with the disability or including people with disabilities might affect the data quality or interpretation of study results, or the people with disabilities would be assumed not to be able to follow the instructions in the study or complete the study. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more background on some of the other work we've been doing on inclusion of people with disabilities. So now I wanted to get into a new product that we're going to be launching next week on May 4th. I will give you the website at the end. It's not live yet, but we will be launching it, as I said, next week. So this is the Accessibility by Design and Clinical Research Toolkit. Let's go next slide. To give you a little bit of preface, and this is drawn actually from the toolkit, from the advocacy section. So there's over 1 billion people globally, approximately 240 million children, and 1 in 4 US adults that live with a disability. People with disabilities are often excluded from clinical trials as far as we can see from what's been published to date in the literature. As you all know, product safety and efficacy and the generalizability of study results depend upon the inclusion of people with disabilities who will use the product. So if people are not included in the testing of the products, you won't be able to know if the products are actually effective for people within those populations. Also, something that's been kind of really under discussion a lot across clinical research stakeholders is that the FDA is now requiring submission of, I should say, diversity action plans for all phase 3 or later trials. These diversity action plans, the FDA and their guidance focus on race and ethnicity, but they also mention that consideration should be given for other underrepresented populations, such as people with disabilities. So all studies phase 3 or later are going to have to be submitting these diversity action plans. Also, proposed Rule 1557 of the Affordable Care Act prohibits discrimination in access to healthcare for people with disabilities. So any organization that receives federal funding needs to adhere to this rule. So why did we work on this Accessibility by Design toolkit? So we did, when we were trying to get into this how, even within our own department, how to really improve accessibility for people with disabilities, we started looking around to find if there's any kind of toolkit, whether it was applicable to clinical research or not. We found a few that were particularly in education, some that were in clinical care. We found a new one from UNICEF, which we do reference in the toolkit, which is for inclusion of people with disabilities and humanitarian response. And then we found a few, I should say a lot of different kind of specific tools. So, how to make web design accessible, or, how to make a building accessible, but not really a comprehensive resource that pulls these pieces together and that is specific to clinical research. Our audience is for, as I said before, these broad stakeholder groups of sponsors, CROs, IRBs, we may have some IRB folks on the call, academic research centers, investigators, and research teams. And we did want to make it a one-stop shop as much as possible. For the moment, it's going to be in PDF format. We do hope to turn it into a web a web portal to make it more accessible. The process for developing this is that we drafted it with our working group over the span of about 9 months. And then we did 2 rounds of review with about 20 plus reviewers that are leaders in their field in disability rights. Some are researchers, research nurses, people with disabilities, and family caregivers. So I did want to give you a little bit more kind of about the overview of the toolkit and also some caveats about what is not in the toolkit. So the toolkit is focused on clinical research, although there are many aspects of it that are relevant to clinical care. It is generally applicable to supporting inclusion of people with disabilities, with the exception of people who lack decisional capacity. So for people who lack decisional capacity, we basically went in the toolkit from the point of that there has been a capacity assessment and you're kind of moving, or you're in the capacity assessment process at least, and then moving from there with either supported decision-making or decision-making without a supporter. We do understand that working with people who lack decisional capacity is a very broad area and a very important area. As I understand it, this ethics series will be having the next webinar on working with people with surrogate decision-making. In the guidance document, we do reference other tools on the capacity assessment process for people with questionable or impaired decisional capacity. We also have a number of resources about supported decision-making. We do not address specifically working with pediatric participants. We do have a number of tools on the MRCT website. We have an entire program on working with children globally. Generally, it doesn't differ very much working with pediatric patients, participants, except that usually they're, so as you know, a pediatric participant cannot give consent, they give assent, and their parent gives consent. We do not include specification for disability data collection because there's not defined standards yet accepted by the clinical research community, but we do reference kind of all of the materials that are going on with discussion in that space around disability data collection standards. We also don't address what reasonable accommodations are depending on what your site offers. We do refer back to the ADA and to different US government resources on what they consider reasonable accommodations. However, it does, different sites do have different levels of resources. So that is always a continuing discussion. So now to talk about the toolkit. We structure the toolkit in 5 themes. One is general considerations, which are applicable across the whole space of inclusion of people with disabilities. One is on communication accessibility, then physical accessibility, newer strategies for inclusion. And this is when you have something that may not be new, particularly in the disability community, but may not be integrated yet into clinical research practice, such as supported decision-making. And we use the supported decision-making example throughout that theme. And then we have a theme on upholding accessibility by design, which is really on advocacy and accountability. So I just wanted to give you an example. So within these 5 themes, we break them out by key points and by tools. And on the screen, we have an example of key points from the theme which is on communication accessibility. So within this theme, we actually have 5 kind of categories of key points. I'm only showing 2 on the screen because I didn't want to make it too small. But on the left, we have the first category is to be respectful, and we have an icon. And the second category is to format communication materials for inclusive reading and mental processing. What we did was, after feedback from lots of different reviewers, they said, okay, all these key points are wonderful, but we really need them kind of organized in a maturity model where we kind of list what we might be easiest to do and what is a little bit more challenging. So we use a color and shape coding system similar to skiing or adaptive skiing that's used internationally, where the green circle means easy, blue square is moderate, and that means something that you might not have expertise in yourself, such as legal expertise or technical web design expertise. And black diamond is something that may require a significant amount of external expertise or resources. So on the screen, you can see for be respectful, for example, we have things like don't ask, assume and practice active listening. We also have use appropriate fonts such as large print or using icons and graphics. And in the blue, we have things like providing a quiet and relaxing environment, or refraining from using animation, which is something that I used to always do, but now I've kind of stopped doing because it's challenging for people with visual disabilities. You don't see on the screen, but in black, we have things like using Braille or creating mega menus on websites so that it allows people to more easily follow where they are within the website. We also, within the key points, you can see in the blue referencing, those are links to tools, which are hyperlinks. So you can link right away to a tool. If we say something like inserting alt text for the use of any photos or images in a PowerPoint, you can go right there and see exactly how to use a tutorial on how to use alt text. So there's many tools linked within the within this toolkit, and anything that's not blue and underlined is just a reference to kind of cite a source. So I wanted to give you some examples of the tools that are in the toolkit, the forthcoming toolkit. This one draws back to our work on eligibility criteria, where we have on the left-hand side examples of problematic eligibility criteria. And on the right are examples of what would be more preferred eligibility criteria. So, for example, the first one prompts the research to include specification for or justification for why a population may be excluded. So, for example, if you exclude people with cochlear implants, explain why. It may be for a safety reason, such as that they need an MRI, and that's acceptable, but just so that it's documented and explained. Let me just see what else is on the screen. We also include something about the capacity assessment. Here is kind of the only place you really get a little bit into the capacity assessment, where we advocate that if you are doing a capacity assessment, that you ask a person if they would like to bring a supporter and include that supported decision-making process during the capacity assessment period, so that the person can have their capacity assessment done while they have a supporter. And because if they have the capacity with a supporter, they should be able to participate. This is an example of another different kind of tool. We have in the main DE&I guidance toolkit, we have something called a sitemap feasibility decision tool, which you kind of see this note at the bottom on the right-hand side, the site assessment of limitations, which basically walks sites and CROs, research teams, through the process of selecting sites and kind of what you need to look for to select sites appropriately. There's one small section in there that says, you know, what do you see that may be problematic? So we kind of put that in the toolkit, and then the second page is an example of a mapping for trying to think through or work through, physically work through, planning out how people get to the site, what their experiences are within the site, and how they get home from the site, whether it's, and that can be a physical site or even a virtual site. So we have things on this screen that are from different disability perspectives, and this is definitely not exhaustive. It's just an example. But for example, if you're trying to navigate the site's online resources, if there's no written directions or alt text, it could be, for example, just an audio file or a visual map, but doesn't have written directions, and there's no alt text, someone might not be able to follow that very well. You may have transport to the site, which is great, but it may drop a person a block or two from the site. They have to cross a parking lot, they have to cross cracked pavement, snow on the pavement, different things like that. You may have a person in a wheelchair who can't access the bathrooms, or I put for an example, because this actually happened to me when I was a grad student, the nursing pod was so small you couldn't actually get into it. So this is just kind of one example of another tool to kind of prompt people to think through, and hopefully in concert with people with disabilities, what these challenges may be. So then we have another example of a different kind of tool that's in the toolkit. And these are flyers or briefers. So we have one briefer that's targeted towards people with disabilities that kind of explains the clinical research process. It's set at I believe, a grade 4 reading level. This other tool that goes over kind of what is clinical research, how can you be involved, how can you ask for accommodations, and what your rights are. This briefer that you see is targeted to people who have been asked to be a supporter for supported decision-making in clinical research. On the front side, the briefer talks about what a supporter is, what a supporter is basically allowed to do, which does vary depending on state law. And then we have on the reverse side, we have more information about kind of where are the decision points in the trial, where a person may need assistance. And then some examples of questions that a supporter may have, such as, do you reimburse me for my expenses? Sometimes in trials, we've really been working on reimbursement of expenses such as childcare or travel for participants, but it's also very important to consider things like expenses for people who accompany the person with a disability or any participant to a trial. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Accessibility by Design Toolkit will be released on May 4th at 11 a.m. If you want to go to another webinar, which is going to be actually quite similar to this one, we will be doing a release, official release webinar at that date. You can register for it on the MRCT site. We are going to be having two wonderful speakers, one of whom is from Eli Lilly and another who is a community member of the University of Michigan IRB. And then I have on the website, or on the slide, sorry, the website for where the Accessibility by Design will be posted. It's not live yet, but it will be live on the 4th of May. Go on. So I just wanted to say, first of all, a big thank you to the different people who have been closely involved in this toolkit development. At the MRCT Center, Dr. Barbara Beer is our faculty director. She's kind of our fearless leader at the MRCT Center. And Juliette Pluviose is one of our newer staff who's been really supporting throughout the entire way. You also see our working group, who we've been working with over the last year to 2 years actually now. I would also really like to thank all of the toolkit reviewers over the last 6 months who have dedicated their time to reviewing and providing comments on the toolkit. And again, thank you to all of you for attending today. My last slide, I just wanted to say, please follow us, the MRCT Center, if you'd like more information. We're on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on the MRCT website. So that's kind of my whole slide deck, and we can go to questions.
Thank you. You have provided us with a lot of resources, which is fantastic, because I think this is an area where people have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of complexity, obviously, because there's a lot of diversity in the population of persons with disabilities. And I think it's just the resources are really helpful. So as you know, we received some questions in advance of today's talk, and there are a number of questions coming in the Q&A. Let me remind folks, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. Please do not use the raise your hand function. That won't work for us today. But I do encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try to include some questions that were sent in beforehand, as well as questions we're receiving now. And I'll apologize in advance if we don't get to them all, because there are a lot of them. So if I could just start by asking you a little bit about investigator discretion. I was really struck when I read the health affairs paper, the degree to which there is sort of latitude given to investigators to, based on their own discretion, not based on sort of specified criteria, include or exclude people. And you mentioned that in the talk today as well. So examples like the one that you had on the slide that said, quite literally, the investigator's opinion about whether prospective participants are well motivated and capable can dictate whether folks get to be included or not included. And really two things here strike me. Number one, I mean, it just seems like there's a lot of room for bias to get introduced into the process of making decisions about inclusion and exclusion. And the other thing I want to say, and this sort of connects to what you were saying at the very beginning, and I love that you did this, to sort of talk more broadly about diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical research. It's not just persons with disabilities who could potentially be affected by that bias. And we did get a number of questions about sort of those issues around intersectionality and other populations. So this seems like a good place to just say, would you be willing to say a bit more about how that investigator discretion might be? It's clear that there's room for it being problematic, but how might it be limited? Are there sort of legitimate reasons for that level of discretion, and how might it be controlled so that not so much bias gets introduced?
I think it's a great question, and it's something in our working group we talked a lot about, because investigators do need discretion, and not to be limited. I would say that there's a few kind of fairly easy things or straightforward things. One is that we found, particularly in that paper that we were doing with eligibility criteria, there's enormous amount of copy and pasting for study protocols. So eligibility criteria would be copied from one study protocol, particularly with the same sponsor or the same research team, copied into the next one. So without kind of a lot of looking at any kind of detail at what this is really, how this may specifically affect different groups. So that's kind of one of the recommendations, is to really try and avoid copy paste, where possible. And if you're using copy paste, to kind of go point and make sure that you're not going to be exclusionary. The second piece, and we do have links to this in the toolkit, is on just training in general on anti-ableism. It's not actually often part of DE&I training, but there's a lot of training now there on working with people with disabilities. It's not meant to be sensorial, but it's really, I found, actually very illuminating, because myself, I find it to be always a journey that I'm working on myself. For example, whether it's, we have in the toolkit information on using person first language, which is where you address, you say, person who uses a wheelchair, you put the person first before the disability. However, that's a really ongoing debate in the disability community at the moment. And we say that in the toolkit, that some people actually prefer to say, for example, autistic person, because they feel that that's more appropriate and they're more comfortable with that. So part of this is kind of being involved in regular training on working with people with disabilities. Then another piece I would just say is that, we kind of harp on this a bit, but try and be, where possible, whether it's the investigator discretion piece or elsewhere in the eligibility criteria, to justify and be specific about, what your kind of the bounds of your discretion, investigator discretion, and why you're, making these exclusions. And I know it's hard. I mean, eligibility, it's already so much work with these, but it's, it is helpful in the end.
I think the point about justification is a really important one, because of course there are harms, both sort of if you're inappropriately excluding someone, or you're excluding someone without good justification, it's as you pointed out in the talk, people in that group then, that group doesn't benefit from the research, but also the individuals who are excluded are
Right.
excluded from receiving the potential direct benefits of the research, right? So, that sort of really gets at what do we really mean when we're talking about discrimination? There's a real possibility for harm here. And, you know, so there needs to be some justification. That just makes a lot of sense to me that you harp on that. Yeah. One other question that a number of people have raised actually is a question about, it's kind of two related questions, I think, but a question about whether your group has done any thinking about the use of community engaged research strategies. And the sort of corollary to that is a point about including persons with disabilities as investigators, right? And I wonder if your work has touched on any of those issues.
Sure. And just to know, I see a question in the chat about cross intersectionality. I'd like to answer that one after this, if possible.
Sure.
So we specifically in our group have not been doing as much on the ground working with people with disabilities, engaging them. However, there are some really great programs, people out there that are doing this research. I actually posted to the MRCT Center, I had them post to our LinkedIn over the last month, a link to a paper by, I want to say her name is Tafri Wijni. She did this paper called We Can Be Researchers. It was a really wonderful example of including people, they had cognitive disabilities. I think it was a group mostly with Down syndrome. And it really went through kind of the whole process of their engagement, how they, any challenges that they had, but it was also written from, they were involved also as authors. And what I especially loved about this paper, and I'm just picking this one paper, there's a number of examples, but they had the summary, the abstract was also written. They had a second abstract, a companion abstract that published that was in plain language written by the authorship team that included the people with Down syndrome. I feel like that should be for every paper that's published, in all honesty, but I just thought it was a really good example. I know that there's some other folks that have been working really closely on the community engagement piece. There's a woman named Susan Magassi. I can't remember what university she's at. I'll think of it in a moment. She's doing really, her name's MEGASI. I'm just always amazed at the amount of community engaged research she's doing. And one thing that we've been trying to do is we couldn't find informed consent forms, published informed consent forms that were in plain language. We had a really hard time finding that. So we kind of created a section in our toolkit that used plain language. And we went through and said where we had challenges with that. Not only plain language, but disability appropriate language. And we did have some colleagues send us a couple of examples of ones that they have used, which on collaborative projects with people with disabilities, engaging them as researchers. And they're even more simplified than the one that we have in the toolkit. They use a lot of icons, a lot of pictures. And some things that I've seen that have been incredibly helpful is they've worked with people with disabilities to make sure that, for example, when you lay out the steps of a research program and what will be reimbursed, it's in a very clear table. You will do this, you know, this will take, you will go for this visit. It takes 20 minutes. You will get X amount of money, you know, and I thought that was wonderful because I find these consent forms to be incredibly challenging. I think most of us do, and it's always a challenge, but to have it, you know, what would you like to see? You know, it usually works for all of us. What would you like to see? So.
Great. So do you want to now circle back around to the issue about intersectionality? We did get a bunch of questions prior about that issue as well. So
sure. So this is something I'm going to specifically talk about. I think I'm just so happy that someone raised this in the Q&A because, you know, intersectionality is so important. I went to a fantastic webinar that the NIH did on, it was on inclusion of people who are LGBTQIA plus in clinical research. It was done in March. And they had a speaker come on who was deaf and was talking about intersectionality in between disability and people who are, working with SOGI communities. And she said it was just so fascinating because she brought up lots of things that people don't necessarily think about. That she said that people who are in the deaf community or people who are in the LGBTQIA community are very welcoming to people in the deaf community because they sort of see them as like, also people who may be discriminated against. But people in the deaf community, it can be sometimes a little bit more challenging to kind of be super inclusive of people in the LGBTQI community because it kind of mirrors our sort of landscape nationally with this. So trying to think that her main point was that you're thinking about people, for example, from the deaf community as being uniform, and their approach would be, uniform across their intersectionalities, and it's not necessarily the case. And vice versa. So one of the things I just want to speak about, though, was the non-English speakers with disabilities, because this is something that we bring up a little bit in the toolkit. For example, in the communication section, we mention if you are developing a portal, a survey, anything like that, that you make sure that not only is every page of that portal, not just the first page, every page of that portal is translated and is accessible in the translated version. So a lot of times we hear from people, great, we saw the portal, but only the introductory page was translated. The other pages were not. So, and there's no help desk in Spanish, the help desk or Hindi or whatever the language is. We can't access any of the help, whether it's tech help or help about the clinical research in our language. Second to that, if you're designing something, say you have a graphic, which is wonderful, you have a graphic, you always have to think about planning for the text boxes to be larger than they are. Because if you have something in English, for example, an instruction saying, go to this office, turn right, enter the door. In Spanish, this may be a much longer text string than it is in English. So you have to kind of plan in advance that these are going to be translated into other languages, because otherwise they won't be, if you have a mess on the screen, it won't be accessible and readable. So.
That makes sense. There's another question that's sort of related in the Q&A where the participant says, it seems like most researchers assume that all disabilities are severe disabilities, which leads to the assumption that most people with disabilities are too disabled. If we can use that phrase, she puts it in quotation marks because, I mean, for obvious reasons, too disabled to participate in research. How much of your research is on educating researchers that disability and the severity of disability presents on a kind of spectrum? It kind of gets
Absolutely.
at similar points that you were just making about it's not a monolithic community, it's a very diverse community.
I think it's such a great point too, because so there's many different forms of disability. Disability can also be, it can be intermittent. So it can be something that kind of, you have it at one point, it can resolve, you can have it come back, it can be progressive. So for something like Alzheimer's disease, you could have something that's progressive. You could have something that resolves. So it changes over time. So you could also have something where it's a visible disability and something where it's not a visible disability. So for example, people with mental health challenges, or myself, I have severe asthma. Like most people would never know that on a daily basis unless, I'm coughing all the time on screen. But, so that's why it's always just important to ask about accommodations and how people would, wish to be addressed and what kind of accommodations they would need. But it is a challenge. I mean, particularly when we're talking about, we face this capacity assessment, because disability can be evolving and it can be changing. So when do you do capacity assessment? How often do you repeat it? When do you repeat it? These are questions we're still working on.
So one more very broad question, and then there are a bunch of people who have questions about specific issues. The broad question is about the difference between inclusion and targeting. This was a question that got sent in prior. Is there a way to characterize the difference between adequate inclusion of people with disabilities in research and targeting that population, and what are the sort of moral differences there?
Oh, okay. I think that speaks to kind of it's a really good question. And I think it speaks to actually the broader discussions that are going on in diversity right now, particularly around goal setting and setting plans and meeting standards. We've had these kind of discussions around these FDA plans. How should I set my goal? Is it according to the epidemiology of the condition? If we don't have data on that, do we go by US demographics? If we're drawing in participants from outside the US, are we just using those participants to then fill this demographic section? So I think we have to be very careful about, how we set targets. They need to be defined as much as possible, according to the purpose of the study, whether it's, assessing a specific condition or a specific product for a specific condition, or if it's something like a vaccine that's more, you need more generalizable data. So you need to understand you need to ask these questions, really at the beginning is, everybody does, but really what is the purpose of the research? What is the goal for your diversity goals, and your aspects of inclusion? So I think that, trying to set a hard goal of we're going to include 20 people with disabilities in this study, I think, first of all, that's not feasible because we don't have good data on it yet. Like nobody's asking really these questions. There's a huge community advocating for data standards. But until we have that data, I think the best thing to say is that, you aim for, to fulfill the specific purpose of that study. You aim for, when it's generalizable, that you have, as much inclusion as possible, and to trying to break down a lot of the barriers I see in the chat, whether it's transportation, reimbursement of funding, reimbursement of expenses. There's just so many of these barriers to trials, and those impact, so many people and across intersectionalities. So trying to break down those barriers, I think, are really important to getting to that kind of more so than setting a specific target. So.
Yeah, so I'm glad you actually mentioned that a number of people are raising those specific issues. I know that the toolkits that you mentioned address some of those issues, right? So it's helpful that we have them. A number of the questions that we've received have been about how do we deal with this particular problem or that particular problem. So I'll give you a chance in a second to do another plug for the toolkit. I will say that there are a number of people in the Q&A who have inserted comments or questions about other resources which center staff can pull together, and we can include, as resources for folks afterward as well. And I appreciate that people are doing that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And so this has been great. And we obviously could talk for another 2 hours and not get through all the questions people have. But let me just let you give one more plug for your toolkit and your resources, and then we'll talk about upcoming webinars.
Well, I just wanted to say, so we will, on May 4th, we will make it live. We would absolutely love comments and feedback, just as what you're putting in the chat here. We tried to find the tools and crowdsource the tools as much as we can, but there's many out there, and we'd like to kind of understand better what else is out there, what else needs to be added to the toolkit. I see someone in here who's a autistic researcher, so kind of your perspectives. One of our key workforce members is a person with autism, and he's been incredibly helpful. But the more information we have, the better. And also, call us out, be as critical as you want. If you don't like the language, let us know, and we will do our very best to make it as appropriate and respectful as possible.
That's great. I mean, one of the questions we got in advance was, how can persons with disabilities self-advocate? And what I want to say is one of the things to do is do what you just said. That is to say, give input on the tools. That would be super helpful. I just want to thank you so much for a great conversation and for, sort of bringing not only the problem to people's attention, but also giving people strategies and tools. That's so critical, really, for dealing with these complex issues. So I very much appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today, Dr. Plosky. Let me also just mention the center's upcoming webinars. So Dr. Plosky also already mentioned that we have coming up a webinar on standards for surrogate decision-making. This is really primarily focused on clinical ethics context, but certainly a number of these kinds of issues can translate into the research context as well. That's our very own Dr. Jennifer Needle, who will be giving that talk on the 16th of May. And then on the 19th, we have, I think, what is going to be a super interesting conversation. Many of you may know Dr. Miles, Dr. Steve Miles, who was a faculty member. He's an emeritus faculty at the Center for Bioethics, who has spent part of his retirement writing a novel on issues that he did academic research on while he was a faculty member here, related to the participation of physicians in torture. And so we would like to invite you all to that bioethics book event to talk to Dr. Miles about the novel and ways in which fiction can sort of enhance our understanding of and conversations about bioethics issues. And with that, I will say thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Plosky, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. See you next time.